Hi everyone. I am Greg Bush, one of the co-culture members, and I have the pleasure tonight, this evening, to uh, to be in conversation with one of my good friends and one of my favorite theologians. Um, so we are going to dialogue about the amazing, wonderful book, Loving Our Bones. So, which I will introduce. I am image description. I am a medium height white man with a wearing a hat with a logo of my home state of Minnesota, where I love. A big red beard, a tan and white shirt, some blue jeans. And let me introduce you first to my then and accomplice and disability theology, the amazing Bekah Marin Anderson. Bekah Sheeho is a queer disabled writer, activist, and theologian. She owned a Master of Divinity from UN Theological Seminary in 2021 and also had the director of pastoral care and community connection for the Julian Way, a ministry offering spiritual care to people with disability. She is the co-convener of the Disability Theology Discussion Group, both member of the United Church of Christ Disability Ministry Board. I member in this summit with the Farm Midden Valley Association of the UCC. She lives in Northampton, where she enjoys playing with the Dungeons and Dragons, sampling many kinds of Ludwig's tea, and entertaining a tiny gray cat, Jasmine. And then let me introduce you to the to a amazing theologian and the author of Loving Our Bones. Well, you can read this too, but I don't have it on my phone. Julia Watchberger, CEO, is a rabbi, scholar, and spiritual teacher who works at the intersection of disability studies, queer, feminist Jewish ethics, and environmental justice. She is a professor of Jewish study at Georgetown University, senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and co-faculty in Georgetown Disability Studies program. A longtime advocate for disability and gender justice, she currently directs an initiative on disability and climate change. Her latest book, Loving Our Own Bones, disability wisdom and the spiritual subversiveness of knowing ourselves. So Beacon Plus 2023 won a National Jewish Book Table. See, a passionate wheelchair hiker, a avid gardener, and a lover of wild places.
Thank you so much, Greg. Can I get a thumbs up to make sure that I can be heard? All right, beautiful. Thank you to whoever provided the thumb. My name is Julia Watts-Belser, and it's a huge, huge pleasure to be with you virtually for tonight's conversation. And I really would love to do it as a conversation. I'm so excited to be Bekah and Greg in conversation with you and friends both in the room and folks who are here virtually. We are going to look for all channels that we can to get your voices in, your voices or your words or your text or your signs in the mix as well. So I'll just say a few words about the book and then turn it back over to Bekah and or Greg to start our conversation off. And then we'll punctuate that by bringing in conversations, questions, and reflections from the physical room or the virtual floor. And I've got my WhatsApp open, so as well as hopefully the Q&A box. So we'll try to keep it rolling on all channels here. Okay. So first, a word about the book. Loving Our Own Bones dives deep into ableism and disability injustice, both in religious texts and in contemporary culture. And it also, at its core, lays out a spiritual and political invitation to reimagine our world and our cultural and religious traditions in ways that honor and celebrate and center the vibrant complexity and actualness, the realness of all our bodies and minds, especially disabled bodies and minds. I think my favorite way to describe Loving Our Own Bones is that it feels like a love letter to disability community. It is, for me, a book, first and foremost, that I wrote out of love and commitment and profound gratitude to disability community and to disability cultures for all of the ways that disabled folks push back against normativity and for the really powerful work that we do to claim each other's lives as worthy. Right. And I'm thinking here, Bekah, particularly of the song that you just offered, like worthy in our beauty and our brilliance, and also worthy in our not okayness. And both pieces of that feel so important to me. I also argue in the book that disability wisdom, disability insights can be transformative for non-disabled folks as well. But I think that's right. That's a kind of conviction that disability offers perspectives and wisdom that this world desperately needs. So I spent a lot of time in the book diving into and thinking with Jewish and Christian texts. My work is particularly, my scholarly work is especially, I'm grounded in Jewish tradition. I'm a rabbi and also a professor of Jewish studies. So people always ask me, what does Jewish tradition have to say about disability? And I mean, it's a fair question, right? It's a big part of my work, especially working with classical Jewish texts. But in Loving Our Own Bones, I'd say the question is really different. In many ways, I'm flipping the question on its head. The thing that interests me most is not what Jewish or any other tradition says about disability. It's what can disability offer to our religious traditions? What can it offer, and how does it inform the way we read and engage and grapple with text? And how does it shape and move in our spiritual practice and in our lives? So with that, Bekah, I'd love to turn it over back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rabbi Julia. This is Bekah speaking. And yes, this book, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, it is so much a love letter to disability communities. And I very much received it that way when reading it. And Julia, I think part of what makes that really come alive for me is one of the things that you do in this book that I don't see in all theology books is you lay out a very explicit commitment to including the work of disabled artists, scholars, and activists as discussion partners in your interpretation of scripture and tradition. You're in conversation with these folks throughout, even and especially those that aren't religious or spiritual specifically. And you describe these as a crucial part of your own canon. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, and if there are any disabled artists or thinkers who've had a particular impact on your own spiritual thought and practice, ones that were in the book, or maybe ones that made an impact that didn't make it into the book.
I love this question so much, and I really appreciate your honing in on this as one of, I think, one of the subversive moments that runs through the book. That choice to say that disability arts and culture, especially the work of non-religious disabled folks, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that feels particularly important in my own life. I guess I should back up and say biographically that about 7 or 8 years ago, I had the chance to spend time immersing in the work of queer, secular, disabled artists. I spent time in Scotland and in Berlin, two places, so in Edinburgh and Glasgow in Scotland, and then in Berlin in Germany, 2 places that have really vibrant, thriving disability arts, queer disability arts scenes. And it probably goes without saying, but I'll just say, like, these are very secular spaces. These are not religious spaces in any way. And spending time with those queer disabled artists was, it felt like balm to my soul. And it felt like an invitation to, it's like I felt so hungry for for ways to crack open some of the constrictions that I experience when I primarily ground my work in sort of more conventional sacred sources, where I feel like the questions are often not my questions. The narration of disability, the way of thinking about especially disabled women's lives, is not really, I felt like so many of these spaces are not, these textual spaces are not really loving my bone, like not really loving the way my own spirit moves. So to sink into arts spaces, to claim them as a place where sacredness is happening, that felt like the key that unlocked a whole other world. I'm really appreciating Nicole has a comment in the Q&A that queer-friendly spaces also often tend to be more disability and neurodivergent friendly. And I think that, of course, in queer communities, there are definitely some places where ableism can run rampant. And also, yes, it was for me exactly that synergy of feeling the kind of wild, wide openness of these queer art spaces that were also explicitly grounded in disability culture that gave me the invitation to take that as a conversation partner and read it, for example, say with the story of Jacob and the angel, or the story of creation, as a kind of thought partner, imagination partner. I think about theology as, in the book I say, I think about theology as a grammar of the imagination. And part of what I want to do is help us think wider and wilder than we have been invited to think before.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you kind of took that sense of spiritual connectedness that disabled art spaces give you, and that sense of your own bones being loved, and are trying to bring that into interpretation of scripture and tradition.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. That's great.
So many. I think and sometimes I don't know if either of you have ever seen the YouTube TED Talk by a by um forgot his name, Ted. Um, but he is spoken word artist. And it from 2011 and 2010. It is about in the YouTube, in the TED Talk, there are a cartoon that he does to a spoken word poem he has about growing up with a speech impediment, a lips. And he talked about when he was little, how one of the favorite things he got from his grandmother's cook shop. But he said karate chops. And in the poem, he is talking about how he was actually taken away from his family because people literally took him to mean that his grandma was beating him up, when in actuality she was making him pork chops. And about how he was made fun of. And for me, as someone with a disability, with a speech impediment myself, that poem was so sacred, so beautiful, so incarnate. I felt seen in a way I never felt seen in church. And a congregation. He spoke, the spoken word artist spoke to my soul in a way I never seen scripture ever speak until I found, years later, I found disability theology, and that's the evening work, your work, and the institute. But how like we can find holy in secular art.
Yeah.
That Google Art can see us in a way that can speak to us in a holiness way.
I really resonate with that, Greg, about the significance of, right, finding a piece of secular art that when we encounter something that speaks, like the poem, the spoken word poem that you're describing, that speaks directly to our soul, I feel it matters to me as a religious part, right? As a person who is grounded within a religious tradition, it actually really matters to me to embrace the kind of dissidence of saying, no, this is Torah to me, right? This is sacred wisdom. When I was in rabbinical school, I started taking some of the particularly feminist poetry, womanist work, disability work that was really that was like soul food for me. And I started I would actually put, like, I had Audre Lorde in between my volumes of Talmud for a little while, because I was just like, you all should learn from her, right? Adrienne Rich, extraordinary Jewish feminist, mostly secular poet, right? I wanted her to speak back, right, to some of the ways in which I felt unseen, unknown by the tradition. And so in that sense, this choice to hold the kind of dissident voices, because I think actually part of what I needed was the kind of rockiness of some of these voices, the naming of violence, the reckoning with pain, the hard-edgedness of some of these sources. I needed that also to be named and reflected, to not have it be all cleaned up and tidy. And so very much in my own work, I try to, whenever possible, resist the tendency to make everything smooth and neat and nice and pretty.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm thinking back to the Hebrew scriptures, and in the Hebrew scriptures, we get psalms, and they are songs of lament and songs that cry out in pain. But speaking from my own tradition, I grew up Quaker, and there were never times to cry out in pain. There were never time to talk about that pain. When you are talking about like these public audits, these secular audits, uh, don't feel constrained in a church like study to confine their sorrow inwardly and their guys and sexual emotions.
Yeah.
Sorry, but
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's reminding me, Julia, of another part of the book that we talked about wanting to discuss. That I think so much of this book is trying to complicate things, right? You in each chapter, you never give only one interpretation of a passage of scripture you're looking at. You offer so many different interpretations of it. And another thing that you talk a lot about is the things that are hard to talk about, the things that are painful, and that maybe we feel there isn't a place to talk about, or we don't want to show to people. And I think this came up this morning in some of Lisa Powell's comments, but thinking about the things that can be hard and painful, or that we grieve about disability, but that we don't want to say because those are the things that non-disabled society will turn around and say, see, look, we told you disability was bad. And, we feel pressured by, these ideas, we have disability pride, and we have, disability is good. And so we feel like we then have to say everything about disability is just society. Everything that is challenging about disability is just society making things hard. And there becomes no space to talk about the things that we grieve, the things that are challenging regardless of how society treats us. And I just was wondering if you had more thoughts that you wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks. I love this, and I so appreciate this question because you're touching on in some ways the chapter that was one of the chapters that was for me the most edgy in the book, is the chapter where I talk about loss, right? And what it means to acknowledge the fact that disability is not only for me a story of, right? So much of my life and spiritual life is grounded in disability joy. But when I am allowed to tap the fullness of my emotions, I want and need, and I believe we should all be allowed to tap the fullness of our emotions. I also know that disability is also a story about loss and difficulty and complexity and pain, and things that are difficult. So there's a chapter in the book where I talk about the longing that the prophet Moses feels when he wants to enter into the land, the promised land. Of course, I can't talk about that. I mean, I'm speaking about that in a moment, knowing how much incredible violence, pain, loss, right? That piece of land and that longing for land. I'm just holding that in my heart right now. So much grief for Gaza, Palestine, Israel. There's just a whole swirl of things. But let me go back to the place that I write about in the book, which is acknowledging Moses, the prophet, wanting to enter the land and being told that he would not. And for me, that became a very powerful place of reflecting on the fact that disability has in some ways also been a story of coming to learn that I will not always be able to enter all of the places, that all the lands that I desire. I am a person who loves to hike. I love the great outdoors. The place where I go to find deepest solace and sense of spiritual connection is not synagogue. It's the outdoors. It's the mountains. And when I've always been a disabled person all my life, but at one point in my 20s, I started using a wheelchair, and many of the places that I love became closed to me. And so acknowledging that, grappling with that, and not trying to pretty that up feels like a really important part of holding the fullness of my own disability experience and wanting to create a space where other disabled folks can do that too. And of course, that also means pushing back against the story that non-disabled culture so often scripts on disabled folks, that disability is nothing but tragedy, nothing but loss, right? Because that's what I think ends up sort of creating this space where it feels so deeply risky to go there politically, right? People are it feels like, the world is waiting for any opportunity to tell my life story as a story of tragedy. And because I don't want that, it has sometimes really closed for me the ability to acknowledge some of the places of my own grief, my own loss, and then to begin to work with them. I don't want to say transform them. I feel like that's a sort of like recuperative move, but just to like learn first that I have resources for living with loss. And also to recognize that there are modes of connection with the earth, for example, that disability has opened up, right? That I didn't know, that I didn't feel as deeply when I was a walking person, right? When I had easier access to mountains, for example. So I think that invitation to go to explore those that emotional terrain in a way that isn't about compensating for loss or cleaning it up. That's something that that feels like spiritual work that I'm really interested in opening space for more of us to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really feeling the part of the subtitle to your book, the spiritual subversiveness of knowing ourselves whole. That when we are only known as tragedy or only known as disability joy, that's not wholeness. Our wholeness is all of the messy complexity of it all, and to know that and to own that to ourselves and to others is spiritually subversive, because the spiritualities that so many of us have been taught haven't made space for that wholeness.
That's right.
And so it is just so radical and subversive to be able to say that. And I could hear in that chapter, the risk taking and the hesitancy, but also the commitment to no, this is going to be really hard to talk about, and we're going to go there anyway.
And I think that chapter really tries to name for non-disabled readers too the ways in which, right, this is like hands off some of these spaces, right? Like actually it matters that folks who might, there's certain moments when you can over empathize, right? And I think this is one of them. I think that actually figuring out ways to acknowledge loss without over amplifying it also really matters.
But I'm in the group Bekah colleagues and the disability theology discussion group. Well, yeah, I am. But you started it. And when we are slowly reading the book, quick time.
Gorgeous.
But slowly, I mean, we started it in January, maybe, and still not finished.
That's beautiful.
Okay, yeah. We
That's
got
beautiful.
the book maybe in the fall. But anyway, when we talked about that chapter, the group is only for disabled people, and it was very beautiful, very hard, very emotional for us, because we felt so seen by that chapter, by what you said, because like someone said yesterday, there was a panel of people in Boston, and one was a pastor. and someone remarked that there were no mediocre disabled pastor. I think in our work, in our everyday life, we have to show up as superheroes to be taken so serious,
Yeah.
to be even taken as with 1 ounce, to be taken with any respect. And even if we don't do that, even if we do that, there's no guarantee that we will be given that respect.
Right.
And that takes a toll on us as disabled folks not to have time to be ourselves and to mess up and to uh uh sorry for touching, but to be fucked ups. That we are fucked up, we are messed up. But for so much of my life, I felt that every time I fucked up, I've proven that I wasn't smart, that I was the disabled uh, that kid who was not smart enough, not fast enough, not fast enough, and like in my like quick wit. Um, um, so I think I owe such a debt of gratitude to you as a author, a theologian to write that. Because that had given me such a release to be like, ooh, that it's hard.
Yeah.
And we need to talk about this.
Yeah.
And we need to find spaces to grieve.
Yeah.
Not and I would actually say not just our disabled selves, but living in a society
Yes.
that is just not built, that is built only to serve able-bodied lives. It's not built for our disabled selves. It isn't built for people in wheelchairs to bump around, or people who can't drive, or people who don't talk normally, people who have to navigate the world without open sight. So, yeah.
Something that you named, Greg, about that demand to always be excellent is really making me think of another thorny chapter in the book, another one that I really was took me to deep places when I was writing, and that was the chapter about Isaac, right, and Isaac's blindness. Because to write that chapter, I flinch back from that story. It's a story that I don't like, right? And of course, there's easy ways to see why I might not like it, because it's a story of where Isaac is being taken advantage of because of his blindness, right? But I felt as I worked with that story that wasn't it. There was something else. And the more deeply I went into that story, I realized the thing that made me flinch most from Isaac is what you named, Greg. It's that he was not performing disability well. He was not being a good, excellent blind person, right? He was screwing up. And he was screwing up in a way that was like implicating disabled folks everywhere, right? And so I realized as I worked with that story how much I carried within my own heart, on my own shoulders, that sense of obligation to always put my most polished together self forward, to always perform disability well, how little room there was to just not be the most stellar. And that's one of the things that ableism costs us. And it is something that I feel really drawn to creating more spaces where disabled folks can name that kind of pressure, right? To and begin to feel possibilities for laying some of that down, at least within spaces among us where we might hold out the possibility of a different way of being together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I so feel that and long for that. And there's so many more things about this this book and these topics that we talked about talking about, but I also want to make sure other voices.
100%.
Yeah. So are there folks either if you're online, you can, yeah. If it is quick, because we got like 15 minutes.
The other part we talked about before coming here is when we were dialoguing together. I think today was a perfect setup for this conversation because we had the amazing theologians they were Boston talk about prayer and lament, about prayer, and then we had Lisa Paul talk about those years at the disabled God. And I think something I am wrestling with and I wanted to bring up with you is how do with it being those years at the disabled God and having disability theology and taking different directions and one of the directions it hasn't taken until more recently is a continuation of Nancy Easling's work. I'm glad you wrote this book because I think you are helping to take it back, the conversation back with other books towards liberation theology. So what does disability liberation theology look like to you 30 years later? And what does it look like in a modern faith context? Because Nancy Easling was looking at it from the Christian tradition, and you being a Jewish scholar, and the Institute is striving to become slowly more modern faith. I just wanted to get your comments quick.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the liberation piece is bedrock. It's cornerstone, and I think that's in part because I came to religion through activism, right? I mean, I came to spiritual life in part. I can't I can't think of spiritual life as separate from the work of and the commitment to building a different world. That for me is inseparable from the project. That's the kind of root and ground. And I think that's probably also why I find myself always turning to and wanting to be in conversation with folks who are doing activist work on the ground. I mean, Bekah, I think in many ways we're coming right back to where we started, right? I think in some ways I'm interested in thinking spiritually about the question of what helps both drive us and sustain us in the work of doing that kind of transformative, pragmatic, but also imagination-drenched work of building differently.
Absolutely. So liberation theology kind of both as how do we get there? How do we get to liberation? And also how do we sustain ourselves as we're doing that work? I love it. So yeah, we would love to bring more voices into this conversation. Folks online, you can either put things in the Q&A on Zoom. There's a WhatsApp chat that both online and in-person attendees should have access to put in comments, and folks in person. I believe there is a roving microphone. Are there folks who want to add comments or questions for Rabbi Julie?
Question from Tamara Puffer in the Q&A, who says that I had once said that religious communities are good at showing up short-term, but not so good at doing so for chronic illness. Can I say more about how communities can show up for chronic illness? And thanks so much for that question, right? I mean, I think this is, I experience certainly in a lot of religious communities that I move through a very well-honed set of community like strategies for showing up for folks who are in acute moments of crisis, right? The example that I like to give is someone is having a surgery or, a kind of acute health event, and the community shows up with in my case, Jewish community, a Shabbat dinner, right? But I have a friend who lives with chronic illness who's like, I could use a Shabbat dinner every week. But you only get one. Like the implicit, it's never stated outright, but the implicit assumption is you get like once a year, right? So she's like, when should I take my surgery chicken, And I think this is so this is such an important nut for religious communities to crack, because it, I think, can actually feel very, it can intensify the feeling of loneliness when the care committee or whatever, right, shows up for everyone with their short-term issues, but doesn't seem to notice the fact that some people have, the ongoing need becomes the baseline, or maybe it's the fear that the need is too great, too much, too big, right? Which of course reinforces so many disabled folks' worries about feeling like we're too much, right? So I think that, I wish I had a great solution to this. I feel like I'm feeling better about naming the problem than sort of knowing how to hack the solution. Yeah. But I'm really moved by some of the work that's happening in disability communities, basically disabled folks, disability friend networks, where I see people. Leah Lakshmi Pyatna Samarasinghe talks about this in terms of care webs or care collectives, right? But it's not like done from outside. It's folks sort of figuring out how to, who has the capacity to offer in the moment And also it's like recognizing the fact that it's not always equal, that some of us have in some respects more need. And I think that feels like a really taboo thing to name. But it feels actually like a really important thing to name in the context of disability, that we're not always operating on the model of full reciprocity. The disabled artist Claire Cunningham, with whom I do a lot of collaboration, has this really gorgeous piece where she talks about sometimes love is not, right? Love doesn't always, right? A kind of care relationships aren't always equal. And sometimes that can still be held meaningfully, justly, truly. I really appreciate that. And I think it's something that I'd love, again, for disabled folks to be talking and thinking about more together. I feel like this is another place where it seems like it would be so great for more of us to be thinking about some of these places of like, what is it like to acknowledge some of these feel like rocky places that I'd love us to be doing more thinking about, and figuring out how do we acknowledge some more of that within ourselves. This is partly about how do we ask for help, but also how do we say, actually, I can't meet that right now, but maybe this person can, so that one person, one community, one friend network isn't responsible for carrying the whole, because there's so many complicated questions, I think, to think about in terms of deep sustainability of friend and care and community support networks.
Yeah, if I can add one thing real quickly, is that so much of this is where that song "I Am Not Okay" came from. Is those moments when, even in these wonderful mutual disability friend circles, nobody's got the time and the energy to meet one another's needs. Everyone is struggling. Everyone needs something. No one has the ability to show up for each other in the ways that they would like to. And it's just a reality of disabled life that, not every part of our community is aware of. And the ability to name that is the first part of finding a way through it.
The Naomi Ortiz, disabled poet and writer, in their new book, Disability Rituals for Climate Change, has some really, really intricate, beautiful reflections on that problem, and also the kind of complexity of thinking about interdependence, not just as a kind of easy to embrace word, but a complicated place to live. So I would lift them up as a great resource, and want to appreciate Kevin Petit's comment in the Q&A that religious communities often respond quite well to urgent and new needs, but after, in Kevin's case, acquiring severe TBI and consequent disabilities, the home church initially responded well, but it took them years to learn how to allow Kevin to be a fully accepted member as a person with profound disabilities. And so this process of kind of learning and figuring also feels like a really important piece. And so I would say this question of like, how do we, whether it's in a friend network or within a broader church or synagogue or mosque, religious community, right? Stick with the difficulties long enough, right? Like, how do we allow ourselves the time to figure out together how to move past the sort of the initial response is one thing, but that like figuring out the long-term rhythms, that feels like a piece of learning that is really important.
Absolutely. We've only got a few minutes left here. I'm wondering if there's a question in the room. Yeah. I want to go to.
Yes. This is Sarah McKenney. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Sarah.
So you're going to get a much longer email from me.
Right.
And if not, we'll also meet on Zoom because I've got all of my answers to our book club.
Amazing. Can I just say, actually, we did, Sarah did, there's plain language materials with Loving Our Own Bones that are available on my website for free download. So 3 plain language pieces. And Sarah did a plain language book club with her community, which was pretty wow. So thank you, Sarah. Please take the mic.
Well, so that was kind of, I just kind of wanted to, I guess, publicly share just a little feedback from that, the plain language, the book club. People really, really, really enjoyed it. Particularly the 3rd chapter was when discussion and passion and debate and arguing just really exploded, but in a very helpful, healing, and a supportive manner. That was also around the time when they really started throughout the whole process. I reminded them and empowered them that they can disagree with the author. They can agree with the author. And so by the 3rd chapter, they were ready to agree and disagree and really enter into some thought and exploration. I just wanted to say that they particularly really enjoyed the exploration of Isaiah 35, 5-6, the more challenging passage regarding people with disabilities, and the topic of healing and meaning curing. And then also into your section of I want a future where disabled people belong, looking at Jeremiah 31, 8-9. So that's my feedback. My last question to you would be, how was your experience writing the plain language version? And I also will say they also loved the audio version and learning that they can do audiobooks. And a final plug to just theologians. This group of people did not want the book club to end and wanted to know when the next plain language theology book was out.
I love that so much. That means the world to me. That makes me so happy to hear. My experience writing plain language. So first, I worked with a beloved friend who I have experience writing plain language in other contexts, but when it came to write a plain language version of a portion of my own book, I thought, whoa, that's really difficult. I was so close to my book as it was, right, is in its standard English form, that I felt I needed a friend, a plain language translator who knew and loved the book and my work, but who could help me get some distance also. So we did a lot of collaborative work. I think the thing that was most important was realizing that the book itself is written in a very essayistic style, right? Bekah, you said earlier, or maybe it was Greg, now I can't remember who, there's never just one opinion, there's always multiple. I tried to bring that into the plain language as well, right? Explicitly inviting readers to share their own thoughts and experiences and not to assume that they have to agree with the author or that the author is always right or that the author's view of spiritual life is like the only game in town. Quite the contrary. What was so interesting to realize, though, was that to do plain language well, I would actually have to really determine what my key, the most important, like the crux, I want to offer this piece to readers. and then build around that. So I really felt like writing plain language was a very clarifying thing to do for me as a writer and as a theologian. But I had to step back from what I had done, and rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to take the first chapter and translate it, right? It was much more a process of saying, I'm going to say, these are 3 ideas that feel like core kernels that matter deeply. And I want to build from the ground up plain language that draws on the book in order to articulate that for this, to really write in a plain language voice.
Julia Watts, Belser. I believe we could talk with you for the whole evening, long into the night. I wish we could, but we need to wrap up. I just want to say the poem I was reference is To This Day by Shane. His last name starts with a K. I don't know how to pronounce it, but you can Google it. There's a link in the Zoom comments, but I wanted to let people in the room who are on Zoom know. But yes, so thank you again, Bekah and Rabbi Julia. And yeah.
Thank you
I
so
thank
much.
you all for coming.